Welcome to the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, the space where research meets the real world. In today's episode, we break down the power of the concept Black don't crack, a cultural adage referring to the fact that Black skin does not show the effects of aging as much as other groups of women. As a result, mature Black women tend to look younger than their years. You can see the embracing of this attitude all over social media. Black women post unretouched pictures of themselves alongside photos taken 10 or 15 years ago. And usually we can see that there's very little difference. Although this ideal has received considerable attention in popular culture, research exploring this phenomenon has been largely absent within the social sciences literature. To address this, today's episode features Dr. Janice Monday, the Herman N. Hipp Associate Professor of Sociology at Furman University. Her research and writing centers the lived experiences of women who have been marginalized by social institutions. Today, she's going to be discussing her research paper, #Black Don't Crack, a content analysis of the aging Black woman in social media. And our discussion includes highlighting how these messages can serve as a positive counter-narrative. I know we're going to be talking about your work about aging and social media and digital spaces, but as people will see when they can click on the articles we have posted for you on your website, you have a larger body of research. Can you maybe sort of situate yourself in terms of what your areas of expertise are?
Certainly. One of the things that I really have enjoyed in my professional life as a professor and a researcher is being able to focus my areas of interest on the experiences of women, particularly women of color. And so I have written and researched about women who have been incarcerated. I've written about women who find themselves on the margins of society and how they push back against the narratives and stereotypes about them. And so if I were to say a common thread that unites all of my research, it would really be about women and how they resist negative stereotypes about who they are in society.
There's a large body of research on the images of Black women, the ways we're objectified and sexualized, and you talk about the foundational images, and I've done some work around the sexual scripting. But what I think is really unique about your piece and which really drew me to wanting to speak to you is that you looked at the concept of aging in Black womanhood and really sort of took a really interesting concept and explored it. What is it that drew you to looking at this concept of aging as it relates to Black women's bodies in the media?
So when we look at the media framing of women in general, typically women are portrayed increasingly more negative as they age. Once you are midlife in your 40s or 50s, which by and large is still relatively young, the media basically acts as if you are invisible, you are unattractive, you are no longer in your reproductive years. What I found is that Black women in a number of spaces, particularly within digital spaces, turn that narrative on its head. So I use the terminology #Black don't crack. This is a colloquial expression that if you're in community with other Black people, you may have heard. If not, what it basically means is that physically, at least in terms of appearance, Black people age more slowly. Now, of course, that's subjective, but this is a fairly common perception among Black folks. And what I found fascinating was that within social media spaces, Black women who are often negatively stereotyped, who are often conveyed as outside of the norm in terms of beauty hierarchies, place themselves at the center of beauty when they talk about their aging process. We age more slowly. We can be 60 and we look like 40. #Black don't crack. And so they take on a role of self-validation, pushing back against the invalidation that many times they experience from the outside world.
Do you think it was unique that you found unique findings specifically because it was in social media, digital spaces? There's so much work looking at television and movies, and you really critiqued it in this sort of emerging self-creation space. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we see in traditional media spaces, print media, television media, film media, is that oftentimes the individuals who have the most power present the images of what they deem to be beautiful. And by and large, within the history of Western media, those are not Black women. Those are not Black people, period. And so the images that are centered as beautiful are white images. Now, at some level, not fully, but at some level, social media has democratized this space. They've given those who are typically on the outside the ability to say, wait a minute, we have something to say. We push back against that narrative. So, for example, we are beautiful. As we get older, we are still beautiful. We can look at our peers and say, we identify as having this physical characteristic or ability or superpower, if you will, to age more slowly, right, than other people. And we just don't see that same type of narrative in most traditional media spaces.
And so, do you think this is unique to Black women, that this sort of more positive image that's being created is occurring for women who are 40 and older?
So I will say that right towards the end of that paper, I mentioned future directions for research, how other marginalized women might reassess their place within society in social media spaces. And there are certain narratives that would suggest that other groups have similar perspectives. So this is an expression that I've seen on social media for individuals who self-identify as Asian. So in the same way we have Black Don't Crack, I've read Asians Don't Raisin, right? Again, pushing back against the aging process for those who self-identify as Asian. And I've seen similar things. I can't quite remember any of the colloquial expressions for those who self-identify as coming from Latin America. And so we see it in a number of ways. Others, those quote unquote who are deemed others, push back against this narrative of their beauty or lack thereof as identified by mainstream society and say, we are beautiful, we age gracefully, we can move through society as mature women and still hold on to a beauty and a presence that society oftentimes deems to be invalid.
Could you maybe give us some examples of what exactly you found, or some examples in the media that were about the Black Don't Crack or aging beautifully for Black women?
So there were a number of different examples. One of the most humorous, and a number of these were, but I would say the majority are quite humorous, which I think increases its effectiveness, were memes. So memes provide a kind of a mental heuristic, an image and maybe a short sentence, but they get the message across really quickly. So you might see an image of, a stock image of like a 6-year-old girl. Okay, cute 6-year-old African-American girl. And then the accompanying text would be, Black woman be like, I'm turning 50 next month. Now, of course, that is hyperbole and it's outlandish, but it's meant to underscore this perception that Black women age much more slowly. I also saw that Black women celebrities were often used as illustrations. Now, this is different because these are real women. This isn't a stock image. They aren't memes. So, for example, one of the images I remember seeing was at the time she was still with us, the late Cicely Tyson. So at the time she was 92 years old, and there was an image of her at her current age at the time, 92, juxtaposed against an image of her maybe in the 80s or 1970s. And it didn't look that as much time had passed as one might expect. And so it was Black Don't Crack. That's all that was said. So Black women celebrities who are widely known both to Black women and to white women and beyond that circle are used as illustrations of Black Don't Crack, as well as these kind of comical memes that sometimes users will create.
How do you juxtapose your findings against the discussions that we've had about presentations of Black womanhood when they're younger, or younger images of Black women?
It's a little bit hard to capture that without giving a really, really short historical context. So when studying Black women, it often helps, or media images of Black women, it often helps to contextualize that history within what's called controlling images. And this comes from Patricia Hill Collins. Other theorists have also explained the impact and influence of controlling images. So by and large, there are three. Now, others have added on to this, but there are three well known. There is the mammy. The mammy is older, maybe middle-aged, but oftentimes a bit elderly. Physically, she's usually heavy set, and she's very subservient, typically to white families. Then there is the sapphire. The sapphire can exist in a number of different physical spaces in terms of the way her body presents, but she is cantankerous, argumentative. She's very condescending to her male African American partner if she's partnered. She's kind of the predecessor of the angry Black woman trope that we see emerge in the late 20th century. And then we have the Jezebel. Now, the Jezebel is distinct from the Mammy and the Sapphire in that, by and large, especially as she emerges during slavery and shortly thereafter, she's pretty universally young. She is attractive. So her attractiveness is not in question. And she's often mixed race. That, of course, is a way to elevate, right, her attractiveness. And because this image emerges during slavery, we can oftentimes not assume, we know that she is a product of a forced sexual relationship between a slave owner and an enslaved woman. And so when we see young women in society, young Black women in particular in society, there often is this tension between how she is understood and defined. So we don't feel quite comfortable with who she is and how she presents because she pushes back against mainstream norms that Black women aren't attractive. So are there ways that we can dig at her humanity? Right? Are there ways that we can strip her of her wholeness, of who she is, of her intellect, of her compassion, and basically who she is as a well-rounded person? While that may not happen for, the Sapphire or the Mammy tropes, because they're not seen as a threat, we do sometimes see that. And so in looking at some of these social media images, if one were to take an example of a celebrity, Halle Berry is probably a pretty good example, right? Who has been in the mainstream for many, many years. And much of that time has been relatively young, right? In her earlier years as a Hollywood actress. There's often, even in very serious roles, there has sometimes been this sexualized overlay of who she is rather than an elevation of her gifts and her talent as an actress. So we still see that it is sometimes implicit, subversive, but it still exists. Just ways in which we have to dig at the character and humanity of young, attractive Black women, because they can't be young, attractive, intelligent, and well-rounded and full humans, because that would defy mainstream norms of who they are.
I think that's so powerful how you explain that. So I'm also thinking now the next stage with your work. What kind of impact do you think it's going to have on Black women, the concept of aging, and how Black women themselves can start or are starting to re-articulate themselves in these spaces?
Absolutely. I think on the ground, the way we live our lives as Black women, I've noticed a number of different strands of research. So, for example, in professional workspaces, could be academia. I think a lot about academia, but even in corporate settings and spaces, Black women sometimes have to navigate institutions and spaces where, first of all, they're one of a few. There are not many who look like them. And if they also happen to be young or even middle-aged, they still may sometimes look younger than their peers of similar age. They have the heavy lifting of not only proving themselves in terms of their intellect and their right to be at the proverbial table of decision-making power, but that they have the requisite experience to do that as well. And so I've seen some scholarship. There's a really great sociologist, Elisa Smith-Tran, who writes about young appearing Black women within the workplace and some of the tension that results from that. And so I hope that there will be more research that focuses on how Black women across the spectrum of spaces, not just Hollywood, and even beyond social media, how they navigate presentations of self, especially as it relates to age, while they're also trying to manage the ongoing and persistent challenges of sexualized and racialized stereotypes about who they are.
So what about you as a Black woman researcher? How has this research impacted you or even how you see yourself?
It's interesting. So this paper came out a few years ago, and I've since entered into a new decade, right? So writing this in my 30s, earlier 30s, I think at the time, that's young, right? I think across I perceive that as young. And as I move in towards this different stage of life, I really begin to think about what it means to move through a professional space in which experience and intellect is prized, right, in academia. But I still, while I feel more senior, I still am sometimes perceived as being young. It's a very strange setting. When you work in particular contexts, not like Hollywood, I think that's a very, very different universe. But in a space like academia, where being 40 is still youngish, right? Because you have colleagues who are 30 years your senior, you find yourself always navigating between feeling, middle-age-ish and outside of those spaces, but also quite young, trying to prove yourself as being duly qualified to contribute to intellectual conversations or to university policy. But then when you move out of those spaces, right, into, broader society, you're old, you're not connected to what's happening. And so I do find myself constantly going back and forth between these particular spaces just because of the unique position that I find myself in. But at the end of the day, I, take inspiration from really a lot of the scholarship that I've read about Black women and center my narrative as in and of itself being valid, not needing external validation, not needing to compare myself to outside groups in order to be deemed valid, but to draw upon some words from the late Toni Morrison to consider myself as the center and to be fine with that, not needing outside validation from other individuals.
That was Dr. Janice Monday discussing her research project, #BlackDon'tCrack, a content analysis of the aging Black woman in social media. To find out more about Dr. Monday, including accessing her book, social media handles, and other research, go to this episode on our website podcast page. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology of Black Woman podcast. We have some great guests lined up for our upcoming shows, so be sure to check out our episode topics by going to our website, www.psychologyofblackwomanhood.com. To stay up to date on our upcoming episodes and get all the information about our related activities, you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks for joining us.